Before we begin, there will be talk of mental health. As I have many times in the past when it comes to this topic, I'm going to leave the number for the National Suicide Lifeline as well as a link to a website. I cannot stress enough how much I do care about mental health. I myself suffer from anxiety and depression. When I was a teen, I did have dark thoughts, but I survived them. Because of my own experience, I want to make sure that everyone who sees my videos has links and numbers to places that they can go to get help that they need. Also need to point out the last time that I talked about mental health, I got bombarded with emails from YouTube asking me to seek help. So YouTube, I am fine. I'm actually in a good place now. I'm very happy. There's no reason to worry about me. With that all out of the way, let's talk about comics. A lot of young people think that television shows and movies about superheroes is a new thing. That's because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and pretty much the failed DC equivalent of that. But this is not the case, especially for Superman and Batman. Superman had movies in the 70s and 80s, while Batman has pretty much had movies in every decade since the 60s, as well as a television show. But Batman also had movies in the 40s. As for Superman, well, he had a show in the 50s, starring George Reeves as the Man of Steel. But George Reeves' life wasn't all glitz and glamour. He had demons. He was not perfect, and after leaving the role, he struggled. And on June 16, 1959, his life would end. He passed away due to a gunshot wound to the head. To this day, people still debate, was it self-deletion or was it murder? Long before he was George Reeves, the man who brought Superman to the small screen in the 1950s, he was George Kiefer Brewer, born in Woolstock, Iowa on January 5, 1914. His mother, Helen Lesher, divorced his father, Donald Brewer, months after he was born. Helen would later tell a teenage George that his father self-deleted, when in reality, he was still alive. Helen had a habit of doing that, lying to her son and being overprotective. And it wouldn't be the last time that she would lie to him about something in such a disrespectful manner. For a time, Helen and George moved to Ashland, Kentucky to stay with family, then to Galesburg, Illinois, where Helen grew up. Helen seemed to not be able to stay in one place for very long, and she had a habit of living with family. She would travel to Pasadena, California to stay with her sister for a time. As a woman of German descent in the 1910s, she found mostly discrimination. World War I just ended and Germans were sort of looked at with suspicion. But a man named Frank Basolo would marry Helen and adopt George, making his name George Basolo. The marriage was strong at first, but then the Great Depression hit. Frank lost his job and had to take one that paid less. This caused a rift between Helen and Frank, one that grew until they divorced in 1942, but more on that soon. As a teen, George got into boxing, but his mother was again overprotective and forbade him from boxing, saying that his face was too pretty to be damaged. He took up acting and singing. He would train at the Pasadena Playhouse, where he met his future wife, Eleanor Needles. I'm going to skip a lot of his early Hollywood career because it was mostly bit parts. But in 1939, he was cast as Stuart Tarleton in Gone with the Wind. A small part, but it got his foot in the door. He was contracted to Warner Brothers after this, and they changed his name to George Reeves. Hollywood back then is not like it is now. If you had a contract with a studio, you only worked for that studio. And sometimes they could give you a stage name, and the only thing you can do about it is smile and nod. Also different is that films took a lot longer to make. But Gone with the Wind was his 5th film appearance, but his first role. The films he did work on for Warner Brothers were mostly B-movies and shorts. He even worked with Ronald Reagan and James Cagney. Warner Brothers released him from his contract and he went to work for 20th Century Fox, where he was in the movie bomb Lydia, as well as other B-movies and bad movies. It wasn't that he was a terrible actor. George was actually a really good actor. It was just that he was put in bad movies. In 1942, he acted in a movie called So Proudly We Hail, a war film about an injured soldier who falls in love with a nurse. This movie did really well, and it was a shot in the arm for his career. He went to the East Coast that year to see family. When he returned, his adopted father Frank was no longer with his mother Helen. Helen told George that Frank also self-deleted when George was away. This was another lie, one that George didn't find out until after Frank passed away in 1944. In fact, he didn't know his real father was still alive and married to another woman who was also named Helen until much later as well. So Proudly We Hail had a profound effect on George. He would enter the army himself, putting his entire career on hold to serve his country. In 1943, he would enter the Army Air Forces. He went through basic training, and he wanted to be just a regular soldier, to the point that he enlisted under his real name, George Pasolo. But he had a recognizable face, and the Army began to use him for USAAF shows like Winged Victory. George wanted to fight, and he made a mistake. So he went to his commanding officers and asked them to choose what he was to do. Either he was going to be a regular soldier or an actor in the military. They chose to keep having him do shows instead of going onto the front lines. Actors joining the military during World War II was pretty common. Kirk Douglas, Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, Josephine Baker all put their careers on hold to fight the Nazis. Hell, even Mel Brooks did, but that was before he was famous. By the end of the war, George was discharged. He went back to Hollywood, but things were different. When he left for the war, he was promised when he returned that he would have work lined up, but that wasn't the case. Some studios ceased working, others slowed down production. He would go to New York to work old radio programs and even some television in order to make ends meet. But the pay was dwindling. He was a supporting actor in the eyes of many producers, and one even flat out told George that he wouldn't do anything more than that. But he persisted. He worked in television, though he did feel it was beneath him. Also, to make ends meet and make sure that he would survive, between acting jobs, he would dig cesspools, which he found that he was good at when he had to call someone about his own cesspool, and found out they would charge him less if he helped dig. The more you know. Pretty sure all of us have something we're good at that we don't even know that we are good at. In 1951, George was offered the role at first he didn't want to take. It would typecast him, and it was on television. Two things he dreaded. But in the end, he would agree to do it, which was being cast as Superman. Before I move on to talking about his time as the Man of Steel, in 1953, he had a minor role in a movie called From Here to Eternity, a movie that won an Academy Award.
Up in the sky! It's a bird!
It's a plane!
It's Superman!
Superman was a blessing and a curse for George Reeves. He had landed a big part, but at the same time, he really didn't like it. Though he was a professional, only a handful of times did anyone ever hear him say anything that was bad about the role. Phyllis Coates told of one, where he welcomed her to the bottom of the barrel. Another time he called it a monkey suit that if Mark Sandrich hadn't died, George would still be making movies. Mark Sandrich, by the way, was the director of So Proudly We Hail, and had promised George more work when he came back from the war. Sandrich died in 1945. George would make the most of it, starring first in a B-movie called Superman and the Mole Men. It launched his television career. He brought everything he had to the character, even changing the scripts to be more child-friendly. If you watch videos of the old show, you will see that he does something that no other Superman actor does. Before his Superman begins flying, he runs, bounces, and jumps up like he needed some speed to do it. I think this is a little issue, but one that actually works pretty well for the character, especially when there was no CGI. Though he seemed like a grump and that he hated the role, he really didn't, because George Reeves was also an amazing human being. George Reeves cared about children. After every season he worked on the show, he would cut out the S on the costume and send it to a sick child. He would go and make personal appearances to not only make ends meet, but to meet with his young fans. George was a smoker, and when he landed the role, he made sure to never smoke around children. He actually quit smoking because he wanted to be a role model. He wanted children to aspire to something greater. He loved his young fans. He took part in events, like fundraising for sick children. For the Treasury Department, he took part in Stamp Day for Superman, where he encouraged children to invest in government savings stamps. But George was getting older, and he wanted to see what other opportunities he could do. George turned 40, and after 100 episodes of Superman, he wanted to do other things. He wasn't being paid much. The scripts were becoming more and more boring to him. So the producers of the show began to look for a new Superman. He went on to try to get a new television show with his own production company, an adventure series called Port of Entry. But Superman producers really wanted him back. They were willing to give him a bigger salary to come back, even offering to make a big budget movie. But the show would end, not with a bang, bang, but with a whimper. It wouldn't be the last time that George donned the Superman outfit, though. He did so for an episode of I Love Lucy called Lucy and Superman. He even toured the country with a trio of musicians and Jean LaBelle to do a Superman live show. But he was eager to do more than just be Superman. But all of his options were centered around Superman. He did get an audition for a role in Psycho, but this wasn't meant to be. On June 16, 1959, George Reeves died. Before we discuss his death, we need to talk about his love life. It is important. As we discussed before, in the early 1930s, he was married, but he had long since divorced. While he tried to keep it a secret, for the most of the 1950s, he was seeing a married woman named Toni Mannix, a woman 9 years older than him, and the wife of MGM's general manager, Eddie Mannix. Eddie had ties to the mob and was extremely Catholic, and Eddie knew about his wife's relationship with George and encouraged it. He was having relationships outside his marriage too. Eddie liked George. They would all go out together and have dinner and vacation with one another. Eddie didn't believe in divorce, and Toni was his second wife. His first wife died in an accident that is suspicious, but is not the focus of this video. Toni Mannix loved George. She bought him his house, his car, and the clothes he wore. But she always worried about one thing, that someone would come along and take his attention from her. In 1958, that happened. Enter Lenore Lemon. Lenore was a socialite and a woman who went after famous men. Some back then called her a gold digger. She married Jacob Webb, who was the great-great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. She then divorced him 3 days later. She also has the honor of being the first woman kicked out of a club in Manhattan called the Stork Club. She was kicked out for fighting. In fact, she was described as nice and sweet when sober, but dangerous and hostile when drunk. And she really loved to drink. George broke off his relationship with Toni Mannix and started one with Lenore Lemon, and this relationship was toxic. George was a drinker, but with Lenore, it seemed his drinking went out of control. The two were engaged within 6 months of meeting, and yet George never once said anything to anyone that they were. Lenore also had a jealous streak when it came to Toni Mannix. She was always afraid that George would go back to Toni. Lenore was one of the 4 people in the house that night in 1959 when George died. And what she apparently said that night was sick and depraved. On June 15, 1959, George got the news that Kellogg's had put down money for one more season of Superman. Of course, his love-hate relationship with the character meant that he would have to don the cape again. This was because a lot of his other projects stalled out, and with his audition for the role of Abergast in Psycho meant that he could possibly have a lot more work coming in. So he went out to celebrate with Lenore. He had been rumored to be drinking all day. He went out to dinner with Lenore, who was equally rumored to be drunk, and they ended up having a fight. Around 11 p.m., they returned home, where George went to bed around midnight, but Lenore stayed up. George had a house guest named Robert Condon. Lenore had been drinking with Condon when a knock on the door came. At the door was a woman who happened to be Condon's lover, a woman named Carol Van Ronkel. The other with her was a man that no one had ever met before, one of the neighbors named William Bliss. The loud conversations over a nightcap woke George. He went downstairs and yelled at the guests. And then he apologized for yelling, sat at the party, and had a drink. But then he went upstairs. Lenore, thinking that she was being cheeky according to her testimony, told her guests that he was going upstairs to kill himself. The guests heard a drawer open. She said that was him getting the gun, and then a loud pop. William Bliss rushed upstairs and into the windowless room to find George laying naked across his bed. His feet were on the floor. Between his feet lay a 9mm German Luger. He had been shot in the right temple, and the bullet ended up lodged in the ceiling, as well as blood splatter on the ceiling. Underneath him was the bullet casing. Lenore, Van Ronkel, Condon, and Bliss all were downstairs when the police arrived. The death was ruled a suicide. Again, YouTube, I am saying what the death was ruled. Please do not send me emails. There is too much about this scene that doesn't make any sense. First, he shot himself in the right temple. The bullet ended up lodged in the ceiling as well as blood splatter, indicating that his head was in an unnatural position when he shot himself. The bullet casing was under him and the gun was on the floor. Those two parts and the fact that he was laying on the bed on his back completely across the bed can be explained. Physics. Bodies do not act like what people think they do when they're shot. They can have different reactions. The bullet casing could have just simply landed there and he could have dropped the gun before falling backwards. But the angle of the bullet doesn't make sense. In order for it to have been in the ceiling, as the blood splatter indicates, then his head would have been in a position while sitting that a head can't do. Pretty much in order for your head to be that way, you have to have a broken neck. So besides the suicide theory, there are a couple of other ones. Theory number 1, that Lenore Lemon killed George Reeves. This comes because William Bliss changed his statement. In his second statement, when George went back upstairs, Lenore followed him. After a bit, the gunshot was heard, and Lenore rushed downstairs and asked all of them to lie and say that she was downstairs the whole time. And they did. Why this makes no sense to me is, Condon was writing George's biography. He had no reason to lie for Lenore, nor did the other two, especially William Bliss, unless they were scared that she was going to do what she did to George to them. What adds to this theory is Lenore Lemon's actions after the death of George Reeves. At one point during the investigation, she broke into the crime scene, grabbing traveler's checks and clothes. Those traveler's checks were for the honeymoon that the two were planning on going on. Within 2 days of the murder, she left for New York, never to return to Los Angeles again. This theory is further backed up by the fact that the only person to claim that they were getting married was Lenore. If this theory is to be believed, then her motive was most likely to do with that, and what the couple argued about in the restaurant before coming home, which some have theorized was that he wasn't going to marry her at all, and that Lenore suspected that he was going to leave her and go back to Tony Mannix. Which is a nice segue to the next theory. The second theory is that Tony Mannix hired someone to kill George. There's a snag in this theory. There were no windows in George's bedroom, which meant that the killer would have to have sneaked past the guests, go up to the room, and then somehow disappear. This is where a lot of people who adhere to this theory point to William Bliss. He was an unknown man. The theory states he was the distraction. Tony had a reason to want George dead. He was living in the house that she bought, driving the car that she bought, and wearing the clothes that she bought. She also called Phyllis Coates that day and told Phyllis that the boy is dead. They murdered him. The boy was what they called George Reeves. In 1999, Edward Losey claimed to have gotten close to Tony in the months before she died in 1983. According to him, she confessed to having George murdered. Again, take this with a grain of salt. The last theory is that Eddie Mannix put a hit out on George Reeves because Tony, his wife, was inconsolable. This comes down to the accidents that George had leading up to his death, including an accident where the brake fluid was drained from his car and he got into an accident. But again, these are all far-fetched, mostly because the room had no windows and the only point of entry was past 4 people. But here is more suspicious elements about this case. There wasn't just one bullet hole in the room. There were multiple. I have read from 3 to 5. Lenore stated later about the bullet holes that she had made them when messing with the gun. The gun had no fingerprints on it. It had been oiled recently and thus no prints could be lifted. George's body was immediately embalmed before an autopsy. His mother, thinking that he was murdered, had an autopsy done. They found bruises on him. So what happened that night is truly a mystery. I leave it up to you to decide if it was murder or if it was suicide. But for me, if it wasn't suicide, look in the house for who would have motive and opportunity to murder George Reeves. Next week, an actor from a popular show is found bludgeoned to death. His secret life is uncovered. And a question: who killed Bob Crane? Till then.